the 10th through the 17th century forms of Confucianism developed very sophisticated. It would be equivalent, actually, the closest analogy I have would be that Confucianism after the 11th century was very much like early Renaissance scholasticism. If you compare how Christianity thought about itself prior to the 11th century and how it thought about itself after the 12th century, the differences are that great. That is, that Christians in Europe actually adopted Aristotelian logic and developed basic philosophical understanding of religion. So the Confucians did the same thing. They developed systems of logic, argument, and debate that in fact would allow them to explain everything. Human nature, human emotions, the relationship between the universal calendar process and what people do, human behavior, keen observation of family relations. They were very important, interested in that, and so forth. So that's really the difference. And Neo-Confucianism is a pretty sophisticated system. Everything from how things change in time through analysis of yin-yang and the 5 phases of change and so forth, to how our physical endowment generates our emotional reactions. So again, tying in diet, tying in environment in through the body so that we can predict how people react to different situations because we understand the laws of change and so forth. All right, move on. After the 17th and 19th century, there's one final movement within Confucianism, and this is a movement often referred to as practical learning. Korea also developed its own practical learning school. This is the equivalent, actually, of modern-day science, where people who are Confucians not only understand that the world is relevant, but now they began to practice what we would call observational testing or evidentiary testing. And in Korea, Japan, as well as in China, Neo-Confucians began to put a much more stronger emphasis upon functionalism. That is, irrespective of what we believe or think, what is the effect of what we do? And so they would look at results first and say, now, how can I get to those results? They applied it to things like not just philosophy, but they applied it to agriculture. They applied it to food production. They applied it to manufacturing. And in time, in the 17th and 19th century, Neo-Confucians turned away from all kinds of metaphysical speculation and, in fact, began to look at functional value of things rather than intentional value of things. It wasn't just enough to understand how the humans react to things, but now it was important for humans to react so that there is a net effect in society. And a lot of the practical Neo-Confucians, in fact, turn their view towards local things. Utilitarianism was the rule. That is, Neo-Confucians became very thing. One of the aspects of why Neo-Confucians became utilitarian and very practical was the influence of Western thought. In the 16th century, a group of Italian and Portuguese missionaries showed up in China. They were the Jesuits, and they brought with them classical learning and mathematics and cartography and all kinds of even mathematical sciences and so forth. They showed up and began to publish in Chinese critiques of philosophy. So a man by the name of Matteo Ricci actually critiqued the Epicureans, and he wrote this in classical Chinese, why Epicureanism is bad, and so on and so forth. So the Chinese were exposed to a lot of Western-based, I'd say, post-Renaissance speculation. One of the most important things that the Western missionaries taught the Chinese was the idea is that you cannot theorize about a thing until you know what the thing is. So if you have a problem, look at the problem first before trying to come up with a theory about what the problem means. All right? And practical learning was most effective when it came to food production. That is, you have traditional ways of creating food. Let's throw all that out and begin to say, let's look at the soil first. What is in the soil that is needed? Then let's look at the crop, the seeds, and so forth. In other words, observation should lead to results. So strong emphasis upon the investigation of things in themselves, apart from their ideological, sociological view. Many Neo-Confucians also thought that the Neo-Confucian interpretation of texts didn't have strong evidence. So what they did was they skipped back to the Han Dynasty and developed a way of interpreting Confucian texts without thousands of years of commentary. They just threw it all out. Very much like the Protestant Reformation, where Protestants decided to discard Roman Catholic history in order to go back to the original text. So Confucians also did the same thing. They jumped back into the earliest interpretation of the classical text without any kind of speculation. Some Neo-Confucians actually became logical positivists, that nothing is true unless you can prove it. If you can't prove it, then it can't be true. All right? We don't expect that of Confucians, but actually they became very distrustful of metaphysics, and they said, we don't care what theory you hold to, show me what the results are. All right? So if you can talk about Confucius and all of his virtues, but if it doesn't have an effect in society, then why trust it? So very early, and in some ways very much like modern-day scientists, they began to. Also, because of the influence of Western culture in China in the 17th to the 19th century, some Confucians actually began to question the value of Confucianism. They became much more entranced with Western ideas, Western sciences, Islamic ideas, other views that they had never seen before, and they were very much interested in economics and law and political theory and so forth, and they thought Confucianism actually is probably dead, so they would get rid of it. So that's just a thing, and we'll deal with that. All of this type of Confucianism also came to Korea and Japan in the 17th century, and they're developed actually within Korea, Chosun Korea, as well as in Japan, schools, various schools that in fact emphasize one aspect of either Neo-Confucian metaphysics versus something else, or Neo-Confucian pragmatism versus something else. And unfortunately, a lot of those debates that went on in Korea also became heavily politicized. So the result was there's lots of factionalism that characterizes the Chosun period. But it's in service of a Confucian understanding of society. Okay, let's now look at Korea. We're now to look at Confucianism, various types, and what it means within Korea. Real quickly, when classical Confucianism reached Korea, primarily through the introduction of books, and in some instances, Koreans going to China to study, they basically adopted Han Dynasty Confucianism. That is, that the idea that the society should be ordered according to the principles of Confucius. Prior to the 3rd century, or in the organization of these states on the Korean Peninsula, Koreans were organized according to a principle that seems strange, but there's evidence for it. The person who caught the most number of animals had power. It was called what the Chinese referred to as the hunt. In the Kogoryo Chronicles, it describes how early Kogoryo kings appointed their ministers after a December hunt. Those people who got the most animals became the highest offices. Okay, so again, very old tradition. Later, Paekje develops this, and Shilla, and so on and so forth. But Confucianism is introduced as a way of, in fact, helping the three kingdoms on the Korean Peninsula to organize themselves. One of the aspects about Confucianism that the Koreans liked very much, and the kings who supported it, was that Confucianism wasn't about clans or clan affiliation or territory. Confucianism was about society and the need for a political system that everyone would adhere to. And the various kings in the various kingdoms of Korea pushed Confucianism as a way of making sure that people conform to kingly rule. Now, of course, there were lots of people who didn't want to conform to kingly rule. They wanted to be independent, but usually they didn't get far. And over generations and generations, all the kings on the Korean Peninsula eventually forced their competitors to go to school. And they went to Confucian schools. So eventually, generation after generation learns that it is right to respect the king. It is right to serve in the military. It is right to pay your taxes. And by that time, usually in the mid-kingdom period, much of the clan organization of Korea really becomes subjected to political organization. So political organization trumps that of the clan. State organizations of Korea, again, that in fact monarchy replaces clan rule, and that laws are, in fact, the product of the king. Later on, they are the product of bureaucrats. But the whole notion that what keeps people together is a sense of law. This is actually, and I keep trying to emphasize this with people who don't think that Korea actually is a civil society. The idea of civil society is very early implanted in Korea. Why would clans living all, separated by valleys and mountains, in fact, ever cooperate? But they had to develop a sense of civil society. Civil law means something. Without it, you lose contact, you lose social bonding and so forth, food and so on. So very early on, this notion, again, that the civil law or civil rule or civil society is in fact a reality. Now, many people say that Korea doesn't have that sense. Well, I don't know. Everything I know of Korea is that certainly the various kingdoms tried to instill that. It may not always have been successful. People did break off and live off in the mountains by themselves. But by and large, most Koreans, in fact, have a strong sense of civil union. All right. In addition to that, Korea imported from China all kinds of literature. One of the great stories, actually, was told to me by a Chinese historian, was we were talking about Korea and China and so forth, and he said, "Why did Koreans always steal our books?" And because there are references in Chinese literature to Koreans coming in and buying up books. And in the Six Dynasties period, 3rd century to the 5th century, we actually have correspondence between the southern Liang dynasty emperor and the king of Goguryeo. And the Liang emperor in the south part of China says, we are sending you the following, and so forth. Could you send us copies of the classics? We don't have copies. So they would actually import books back from Korea back into China. And the Koreans did this all the time. They brought in literature. They either did it directly by going to China, buying up books and bringing them back, or sending students from Korea to China for 5, 10 years where they studied, and then they brought back the books. And every time Korea went to congratulate the emperor on his birthday, they would always have somebody there buying books. So everything was brought into the three kingdoms, and the ruling elite, which now is subservient to monarchy, did in fact promote, at least among their own class, this idea of literary education. And schools and academies were created where people would learn to read classical literature and so forth. So in the early period of the Three Kingdoms period, Korea really adopts what I would call classical learning. It's not really Confucian, but it's a sense of classical learning in the same way that, at one time we expected everybody to be able to read and write Greek and Latin, right? We don't expect that anymore. But when I grew up, my brothers, sisters, my whole family were expected to complete our classical education before we got into high school. So you had to be able to read Greek and Latin, in my case, Hebrew, and so forth. But this was expected. Same thing in Korea. Koreans really adopted so much Chinese literature and so on and so forth. And of course, Koreans did not write in their own language. When they wrote anything at all, they wrote it in classical Chinese. So again, that doesn't mean they weren't being less Korean, only that they were using what was available. Early Korea also developed the civil service exam. Their foreign relations with China always used China as a way of protecting them against intruders, so that when Shilla wanted to conquer 2 other kingdoms, it got the Tang army to come in several times. When the Khitai invaded Korea in the 11th century, they got the Chinese to come in and protect them. When the Jurchid Proto-Mongols came in, they got China to protect them. When the Japanese later in the 17th century come in Korea, they get the Chinese to come in and protect them. So Korea had this strong relationship with China that in fact allowed their security to be in fact taken care of that. All right. Yes.
Can you explain a little more about the exams?
Civil service examination began as early as the 4th century, continued on all the way down to the 20th century. What the civil service examination is that members of a certain class, usually an elite landowning class, would either through private schooling or publicly sponsored schooling learn classical texts, learn classical history, learn to write poetry, learn to write prose, so forth. This would qualify them to take an exam to get into a national academy. Then, depending upon which period, they would either spend 5, or they could spend up to 9 years in this nationally sponsored academy, going through every classical text that is associated with Confucius, at the end of which they took an exam. And the exam was just basically a set of questions that the examiner would ask, what does, King Chang of the later Han Dynasty's action at a certain battle mean for government? So they had to know all these things. And then they would write essays. Not only they had to write essays, but they had to write essays in what are called rhyme couplets. It's called parallel prose. So they had to analyze the question in ways that every 5 characters rhymed with the next 5 characters. Very elaborate form of civil service. If they passed that exams, then they would go on to other studies and then pass more exams. Eventually, they would take what's called the Tekko, or the highest exam, upon which, if they successfully passed it, then they could be appointed to office. Okay, it's very much. Any of you taken the civil service exam here in the United States? Yeah. Take a civil service exam, you get a ranking within the U.S. government, GS-12, GS-9, 8, 7, blah, 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 and so forth, and you become a bureaucrat. And the civil service exam, they're primarily, at least from the beginning until about the 10th century, examined people's writing skills and their knowledge skills. After the 11th century, the civil service exam tested their philosophical skills. So what does Jushi mean when he says this about the classics? Okay? And in Korea and Japan, Jushi Neo-Confucianism became the orthodox curriculum. So you had to know everything that the Song Dynasty Neo-Confucian philosopher said about anything. Right? Now, and then emphasis was on content rather than writing. In the early years, the emphasis was on how well you could compose a document. Good story. Then when the Mongols took over China, Mongols didn't like the Chinese. Chinese didn't like the Mongols. But the Mongols actually wanted to put down the Chinese. So one day, actually an early Neo-Confucian, late Koryo, early Chosun dynasty, a man by the name of Isek was living in China. And Kublai Khan, emperor of China, called Isek to his palace and so on and so forth, and decided to, in fact, he asked Isek, what was the meaning of such and such from the text? And Isek went into a long discourse about the whole meaning of the text, where it came from, what does it mean, and so on and so forth. And Kublai then made a pronouncement that he thought that the Koreans understood the meaning of words, but the Chinese could only draw the character. And this was a typical Mongol putting down the Chinese, right? So Kublai and actually his successors tended to promote Koreans in China and give them high offices because they weren't Chinese. They were beholden to the Mongols, and then of course, they intermarried with the Korean royal family. And the last 7 kings of the Koryo period didn't even have Korean names. They were all Mongol. They were trained in China, living in China, in Mongol China, and so forth. So, but the whole idea was that early Confucianism in Korea was basically bureaucratic, and later Confucianism is highly philosophical. So you have to be able to argue something. Also, they changed the nature of the exams. In the first set of exams in the early period, how well did you write? That was the question. In the next thing, what did you write? And what was your reinterpretation of a meaning rather than how well you could write about it? Yeah. There were exams that looked at military logistics, weaponry, medicine, tax policy, manufacturing, but these were considered low-level exams, and the highest exams were the ones that dealt with literature, and Confucian theory. Yeah. Actually, there were a whole set of military exams in Korea that you could get rank by taking these exams. And up until the 12th century, most of the highest office holders were actually of military families that had made their way into the bureaucracy as military. And for a while, they actually took over civil functions during the Che regime. And that's when they became known as Yangban, which means that the military usurped the right of civil officials and they governed both sides of the aisle. Later on, the military overthrown and the bureaucrats take both sides of the aisle. So, yeah.
Were there
Low-level exams,
Which ones are the ones that, I know that some of them, like a commoner cannot take. So where's the differentiation between like the ones that the nobility could take and the ones that actually commoners could take and get some kind of job in government?
the people of low rank, first of all, nobody can take an exam unless they're schooled. All right, that'd be able to read and write. Normally, commoners couldn't take the exams; they would not be schooled. So, until the development of national academies, basically, you had to educate yourself in a private school, and landowning gentry would develop their own schools for their children, and they would then invite teachers in to teach them how to read and write. But the distinction between what type of low-level exam versus high-level exam is really what level of office you can be appointed to after taking the exam. So if you are a country magistrate whose only responsibility is to collect taxes, then that's a low-level position. You're not in the capital, you're not near the king, you're not in the central government, you're out in the country and you're just keeping. Or if you are part of population, Department of Public Works, where you have to keep a census of a local village, that would be a low-level exam. And the idea was that you took a simple exam on mathematics and statistics and so forth, you passed that, and then you were assigned to the countryside, and that would give you the position, but you could not rise up in rank from provincial to capital, and within the capital from lowest level to the prime ministership, unless you had taken certain exams. So every
Commoners cannot get into the system.
no,
Even in the military?
commoners can become enter into the military. Yes, they can.
Rise through the ranks?
Yes, yes, and that was true all the way up to about the 15th century. Then the Confucian bureaucrats decided they wanted to be military, so they took over military functions. They didn't know how to do it, but they took over it. But throughout the Koryo period, late Shilla period, you could join the military and keep signing up for it, after tours of duty. And in time, if you did well, you could actually get a rank within the military, which meant that your children then would get automatic ranks thereafter. So the mobility within the Three Kingdoms and Koryo period was oftentimes through military. And why spend all your time reading books when you could, in fact, be in charge of a local fortress or a coastal fortress and make a record for yourself? And in China, in Korea, as in both civil and military offices, once you got appointed to any office within the government, either provincial or central, you were then given a land stipend, which means your family could be moved to this land and they could live off whatever farming they could do on the land. So your life was really guaranteed. It was an emolument that unless you did something really bad, you'd never lose that land. And it was a way to rise up in rank. So, yeah.
Was this only for some children or people who came from primary wives? What about those who came from secondary and tertiary?
The whole question of where people came from and who was their mother, primary or secondary, didn't really become an issue until the 14th century. Prior to that, I mean, you have wonderful stories of thieves, who get appointed to offices in the provincial government. If you were really smart and you know how to sort of wheel and deal yourself, you could get into government. Not very high, but the examination of people's background before they took an exam really is something quite late. Okay, so. All right, and then of course, also in the early period, Confucianism was not exclusive. That is, that in early Korea, Confucian scholars studied Buddhist texts. Buddhist monks studied Confucian texts. Buddhists and Confucians studied Taoist texts. So there was a kind of blending of these three traditions within China. It was very common. And one of the great stories I like to tell about is that before the development of public education in the early Chosun, Korean Confucians who were trying to get ready to take exams didn't have any school to go to. If they didn't have a private school on their family land, then there were no public schools they could go to. But the one place that Confucian scholars, would-be bureaucrats, would in fact learn was they went to a Buddhist temple. And Buddhist monks often instructed Confucian bureaucrats in the classics. So Kim Shi-sup, early Chosun Confucian, when he tells us that he learned the Analects of Confucius from a monk, and the monk taught him what the classical learning was, and so on and so forth. So all throughout, up until the Chosun period, basically the three traditions were all mixed. And the view the Koreans had was that if China created it, it must be good. So we can't exclude anything. So they studied Taoism, they studied Confucianism, they studied Buddhism, and in fact, it's really hard until the beginning of the Joseon Dynasty to really say what what Koreans are. They engage in Buddhist ritual. They read the classics of Confucius. They compete for exams, or jobs and emoluments primarily through the Confucian system. They pay their taxes. Occasionally, they invite shamans in to carry out exorcisms and so on and so forth. And the three traditional religious things, really are mixed. Everyone's engaging in everybody else's practice. That will change in the Joseon period, where the others will think. So this is the early period. Okay, now we're in Japan. Same thing occurred in Japan. As early as the 3rd century or 4th century of the Common Era, Confucianism, classical Confucianism, also entered into Japan, but it came to Japan via Korea. In the Kojiki, the oldest Japanese historical document, we actually have descriptions of how ambassadors and envoys from the Korean Peninsula arrived in Japan and brought with them what they call hitobishi, literally masters of the brush. Hitobishi, somebody who thinks. Japanese apparently couldn't read or write, but suddenly along comes a person who teaches them how to master things. The reception of these envoys from the Korean Peninsula, they didn't know what to do with this hitobishi. So they said the hitobishi, the man who's expert in writing, is to be assigned to the emperor's harem, his harem, his woman's quarters. And so the Kojiki reports that after that time, imperial women in Japan learned to read and write because they had been instructed in reading and writing. Anyone know that the first literature in first literature in Japan is composed by whom? Women. Okay. Up until the 11th century, almost all the major works of Japanese literature are composed by women. Women write in classical Chinese, they write poetry, and so on and so forth, even to the point that when men try to write, most of the time men are not concerned with reading and writing, but when men try to write, the only way they can get people to read their poetry is to adopt a woman's pseudonym. So they call themselves Lady something or other. And then people will buy their book. So the notion is that women know how to read and write. So the same thing, Confucianism is introduced. In 520, we have actually in the Kojiki a letter from the king of Pekche to Emperor Kineko, I think, in which the envoy from Pekche says to the king, in addition to what I have sent you, I'm also sending you Buddhist monks, and they will teach you a kind of wish-granting doctrine. And you please listen to them because the subtlety of their teachings is even greater than that of Confucius. So by the 5th century, the Japanese already know who Confucius is, so that when the envoy says, I'm sending you a Buddhist monk to teach you, they know that this is like Confucianism and so forth. Also in the same year, 591, the heir apparent to the Pekche throne arrives in Japan, and he is held hostage there, or he stays there until his father dies. He brings with him yin-yang masters, literally masters of the teachings of yin and yang, so Taoist metaphysics and so forth. A year later, the Japanese published their first calendar. And the calendar, of course, is a calendar that tells you where the stars are on every day of the year, when the 24 turning points of the solar year occur, and what rituals should be carried out on those 24 turning points. Again, it was a Tang Dynasty invention. Koreans had calendar, Japanese got a calendar, and so forth. It's very clear that when Prince Shotoku, the nephew of the Empress, what's her name? Suiko, Empress Suiko, that when Prince Shotoku Suiko is in fact in her minority, and Prince Shotoku becomes the regent, that Prince Shotoku, who writes the first constitution of Japan, in fact starts off with the phrase, harmony is to be valued. Let everyone in Japan learn the teachings of the three sages, Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Buddha. And the 17-article constitution promulgated by Prince Shotoku, in fact, emphasizes the need for Japanese to learn the traditions of China. Okay? The second article of that constitution says warfare among the uji, among the various clans, is to be avoided. Again, Japanese society is one in which there was constant warfare among clans that controlled different areas of China. The first clan names that appear in Japanese history are actually the names of areas. So the Izumi clan is actually an area where rice is grown in the northwest side of the island of Honshu. And so the Izumi clan is actually refers to a region. So the Izumis that are that. Later, Izumi becomes the goddess of grain who is worshipped in that area. So the clan relations, in regard to territory and their adherence and so forth, that has to be replaced so that the imperial office, in fact, can hold sway. It's largely through Confucian learning that the Japanese learn to give their adherence to the emperor. Okay, and it takes quite a while, actually until about the 11th century, where the Japanese will adopt, no longer make reference to their own clan history, but now begin to make reference to Chinese history. So Confucianism serves as a kind of counterpoint to native tradition. State organization, rule of law, again, replaces the clan loyalties of the Japanese. And then, of course, like Korea, Japanese also adopt Chinese literature, history, and the writing system. So Japanese usually composed in classical Chinese up until the 10th century. Thereafter, they can compose in Japanese. The Mandate of Heaven, again, the Japanese didn't like the idea that the Emperor of China would, in fact, protect them. So the Japanese reinterpreted the Confucian documents to say that with the fall of the Tang Dynasty, Tang emperors die and so forth, that the mandate moved from China to Japan. And thereafter, the rulers of Japan were called emperor. So they didn't really send tribute to China or anything like that. They expected the Chinese to send tribute to Japan. It was a nice thing that was created in the middle of the Heian period that the Japanese did. But again, they used that justification for Japanese power within the area. And of course, they also tried to teach Japanese, these early teachers taught Japanese that they should be virtuous, they should take care of your family. One of the very important ideas that blended with Japanese native sensibility was the notion of graciousness. In Japanese, it's called aware. Aware means to act in a way that is fitting to the circumstances in which I find myself. So you're crying, then I comfort you. You're hungry, I feed you. So being aware of what the circumstances are is very important. So in early Heian period literature, primary over and over again is that the cultured person is one who has aware, they have sensitivity. And the sensitivity is very similar to what Mencius says in the Confucian classics, that what you do in terms of behavior is dictated by the circumstances you find yourself in. So there is no universal behavioral model, only the circumstances will tell you how to behave. So you have to be aware of them. How do you get aware of them? You study, and you become very refined, very sensitive to social relations. So again, these seem to be the effect. One of the things that did not appear in Japan was the bureaucracy. Up until the 16th century, the Japanese did not have a Confucian bureaucracy. There were none. The people who ruled China or Japan all this time, who studied the Confucian classics, were in fact members of powerful clans who intermarried their daughters into the imperial family and thus were appointed to office. So there was no examination system, no public schooling system, none of the things we would expect of a Chinese informed Japan are there. The texts are there, and the Japanese do have a sense of it, and you can find Confucianism in government documents, but there seems to, in fact, have not been any great influence of Confucianism on the Japanese populace. Instead, the Japanese became Buddhists, and Japan is the only North Asian country that almost exclusively became totally Buddhist. Everyone, all across all sectors, in fact, became part of the Buddhist establishment. And they remain so. Even after the Tokugawa bring in the samurai and the samurai study Neo-Confucianism, the Japanese are still Buddhists because Buddhism is really strong today. Even today, the functions of Buddhism are still pretty much what they were in the 12th century. When people die, their statistical data has to be registered in a Buddhist temple. The government then goes to those Buddhist temples to get the statistical data. So if you live in a Omachi district within any city in Japan today, and you die, somebody who represents you must go to the local temple to register your death. Okay? It's also a way that the government keeps records of what people are doing throughout. But again, it's not a Confucian temple. It's not a Confucian department. It's a Buddhist one. So Confucian really, its general effect doesn't really affect most people even below the level of the ruling elite. Okay? When we now move to, sorry, where's Neo-Confucianism? Okay. Oh, okay. When we move to the 16th century, that is the establishment of the shogunate, the first shogunate in Japan in which military leaders co-opted the power of the emperor, occurs as early as the 11th century. And from the 11th to the 16th century, shoguns battled for control of Japan. Meanwhile, the emperor himself in Japan is starved out to death or killed, and it's really strange. The emperor lives in his palace in Kyoto, but he has to send his daughter to the samurai shogun to ask for money, to ask for food, and so forth. At any time the emperor doesn't agree with the shogun can starve him out by cutting off food supplies to the city of Kyoto. And this happens over and over and over again. So from the 11th century on, the shoguns are in charge, and that continues all the way down to the 19th century. One of the things that the shoguns did was they fostered, or at least they tried to foster, a sense that Japan was really equivalent to China. So the shoguns would send scholars from Japan to China, get the exams, study the text, bring them back. And all throughout the late Kamakura period, 13th and 14th century, the people who were sent to study in China and bring back the latest knowledge and so forth were Buddhist monks. They were often referred to as the Gozan, literally the 5 recognized schools of mountain Buddhism in Japan, whose members were sent to China to study and bring back texts. So Neo-Confucianism was first studied in Japanese monasteries. Later on, when the Edo period is created and Tokugawa Ieyasu becomes shogun of Japan, he decides to, in fact, turn his samurai compatriots, into bureaucrats. And the first thing he does is he recruits Confucian scholars to, in fact, come up with a code outlining the social classes of Japan. So there is the lower classes, the servant classes, and then there are the Kongin, what the Chinese Koreans call Kongin. There are the technicians and artisans, and then there are farmers. Then there are the city dwellers called the Chungin or Chongin. These are middle class, and then above them are the samurai, and then the imperial family, or the shogun's family. So in the Edo period, which begins in 1600, Neo-Confucianism is deliberately introduced by the shogunate, and the samurai class are forced by the Edo shogun to give up their military skills and become bureaucrats. Even to the point that in 1620, Tokugawa Ieyasu outlaws the use of swords, knives, and so forth. So the samurai don't have any weapons anymore. Instead, they are turned into bureaucrats. Okay? Then in 1640 and thereafter, a series of proclamations by the shogun of the Edo period, he restricts the movement of samurai so that they stay in the capital or they stay in wherever their position is. Their family can live anywhere they want in Japan, but they cannot visit them. So the samurai are slowly turned into a hereditary bureaucratic class. And what they do, they don't really have any power. They're not like Chinese bureaucrats. What they do is they study Confucianism. So they study all the Neo-Confucian texts, and they debate, and so on and so forth. But they're not actually allowed to actually rule. So many of the samurai end up being scholars, studying Confucianism. That maintains their rank. And then, of course, among samurai, Confucian morality is absolutely maintained. Because being part of the samurai class means you are land owning. If you fall out of that class, then you lose your land. Okay? You have to go live in a city or live on the outskirts of the city. So samurai had to conform, in order to maintain their use of land, they had to maintain their class. They were told that the way they maintained their class was to study Confucianism. Okay? And so codes for samurai ethics constantly being promulgated. By the 18th century, the samurai in Japan did begin to promulgate Confucianism among the lower classes, but not very successfully because Buddhism was still in effect. So the expectation of middle class, farming class, worker class, and warrior class was that they would conform to the samurai ethics. But in Japanese law, only the samurai were responsible for failures in ethics. So samurai could be punished if they were not filial. A samurai could be punished if they did not understand the classical texts, the Neo-Confucian texts and so forth. Lower classes, like the Chungin class, the technical class, the artisan class, they were never punished. But they didn't have any land anyway. So the lower classes really weren't that much affected by Confucianism. So the samurai class in Japan does it. A lot of these samurai did in fact become great scholars. Ibara Aiken, Sozeki, and then later people like Nobunaga Matsuo did in fact do some tremendous work. They became what we would call today anthropologists. They studied local history. They studied legends. They wrote up encyclopedia and so forth. But that's all they had to do. They didn't have to run the government. All they had to do was maintain their class. And so by the 17th and 18th century, the Japanese samurai class, as Confucians would in fact study Japanese myth, the discovery of ancient Japanese dialects, the discovery of early Nara period poetry. This was done by the Neo-Confucians. They studied everything, right? And without reference to China. It was their job to study, and they were commissioned to write histories and so on and so forth. Some of the classical learning in the 18th century is a bit strange. I mean, Kuwabata Chikafusa was a Confucian scholar in Japan who, after he had read a Chinese translation of a Latin work called The History of the World, decided to rewrite the history of Japan. So he instead of talking about Adam, and the descendants of Adam, he talked about Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and her descendants. So he rewrote the history of the world in which all of the world's populations come from Japan. Right? So, and it's great. It's a great story. He pushed Japanese history back 250,000 years. And in fact, he enunciates all the reigns of all the emperors that ever existed prior to any recorded history and so forth and so on. He actually talks about how the mother language of the world is Japanese, and that when people forgot to speak Japanese well, they ended up speaking Sanskrit, or they ended up speaking Chinese, or they ended up speaking Korean, and so on and so forth. So a lot of scholarship done. It didn't really have a lot of effect on the ordinary population, but it is part of the tradition. All right. The samurai classes, again, were also from the 17th century on not allowed to interact with lower classes. Why? The lower classes, according to official Edo period documents, were mean, M-E-A-N, meaning that they had low class interests. And if samurai became involved with them, they might lose their sense of morality. Also, and this is clear in the Tokugawa shogun's rescript, is that if samurai associated with lower classes, samurai would gain a love of money. And the one thing you don't want is Confucians becoming worried about money. So samurai were kept poor deliberately by the government. And they could not associate with the lower class. Meanwhile, in the cities of Edo, Nagoya, Kyoto, the middle class, the Chungin class, is making money hand over fist. All right? Eventually, this Chungin class will become the antecedents of the modern industrialists. They're producing things. They're engaging in overseas trade. They're making huge amounts of money. And some of them buy samurai status. Okay? So not only do they have all the money, the urban classes have all the money, but now they have also the status. By the time we get to the 19th century, the samurai class is gone, really. There are a few samurai families around, but most samurai have either become middle class or, they deliberately did something, so they ended up in the industrial elite and so forth. So by the 20th century, the industrial elite is in charge, but they have nothing. Neo-Confucians, Taoism, Shinto, Buddhism are still there as religious options, and the samurai are expected as Neo-Confucians to study all of them. So samurai write histories of Shintoism, write histories of Buddhism, write histories of Taoism, and so forth. By and large, the net effect then of Neo-Confucianism in Japan from the 17th century on is primarily academic. It doesn't really have widespread effects within society itself, but it's a mechanism whereby the shogun can maintain his power by keeping these Neo-Confucian scholars so occupied with their studies that they don't affect government. Huh? The shogun government, primarily samurai who were given temporary offices, because the shoguns never paid the bureaucrats, right? They gave them land, and as long as the bureaucrats didn't interfere with the government. So what the shogunal government did was they employed for a salary these middle-class urban dwellers to do things.
I guess another thing, how did the shogun then still maintain his military power?
He didn't.
So he just.
He disbanded the military. Yeah.
So no military.
There are no military expeditions by the Japanese until the 19th century. He literally disbanded the military. Huh? No, the shoguns closed the borders of Japan from the 16th century on, and no one was allowed to come into China, or no one got. That obviously there were military guarding the border areas, but they were low class provincial elite that were paid to stay there and keep foreigners out. So when the Dutch, for example, are out exploring the East Asia, one of their boats crashes next to Kyushu, and the Dutch they don't know what to do with this Dutch guy. Korea had the same problem. Lots of Dutch showed up in the islands and so forth. So, but they didn't know what to do with him. They couldn't kill them because they were afraid of the guns and so on and so forth. But basically, they tried to get them to intermarry with the Chinese or the Japanese, so that they would eventually be subservient to the shogun. Yeah, the Edo period is very strange because it's complete demilitarization of the country. I mean, the Edo shoguns have fought for 50 years among themselves just to get to power. But once they got into power, they stripped the country of its military.
It's still hard to understand how they stayed in power.
They stayed in power because basically divine neglect. The people who had money, they allowed to make as much money as they possible.
So
They-
the nobility was basically
They're gone.
by the middle class.
The middle class, the nobility are gone.
Right.
All those powerful clans are gone. There's only the samurai and the middle class.
So he's doing like what Louis did.
Right. And then, of course, the middle class can't leave the country.
Right.
So all the money, all the food, all the technology that is produced by the middle class stays in the country. Some of them did actually leave the country. They became pirates, in South China and things like that. But that's about it. So anyway, the point here is, of course, is that Neo-Confucianism really doesn't have an effect much on the Japanese at all. Okay, and I emphasize that because I want just the opposite case for the case of Chosun. In Chosun, Korea, the Neo-Confucians really do change society. Okay, almost. Neo-Confucianism in the Chosun period, of course, is revolutionary. The history of Neo-Confucianism, of course, is beginning in the 11th century, after the Mongols invade Korea and become basically the rulers, post factum rulers of Korea, take the Korean kings and their sons hostage and raise them in China. The Mongols, who don't like the Chinese at all, encourage Koreans to come to China, take the exams, become part of the bureaucracy of China. The more that the Mongols can do this, the more they can put Chinese in their place. So the Mongols employed a lot of Koreans in their bureaucracy and brought them. The Mongols also established, especially after Korean kings married into Mongol princesses, the buying of books, so that Koreans would, in fact, go to go to the city of Beijing, Datu, and they would buy books and then bring them back. And again, in the politics of the day, Kublai Khan, constantly was encouraging the Koreans to pass exams, to study hard. There were academies for the study of Chinese classics in Beijing set up by the Mongols. These were reserved schools just for Koreans, so that the Koreans would have an edge in taking the civil service exams. It was because of that in the year 1200, the Mongols lift the restriction on the publication of Neo-Confucian texts by Jushi and actually issue national copies of Jushi's commentaries. Koreans get them. The first man to get a copy of the Neo-Confucian text was a man called An Hyang. He was in an embassy to China. He brought those texts, started teaching them in his private school. He was very interested, especially in Jushi's understanding of ritual. So what's called the Chuja Kare, Jushi's family ritual book, was brought in, and the Koreans had never seen this before. So in their private academies and private schools, they taught this notion of ritualism. The people who, of course, adopted Neo-Confucianism into China are what I would call provincial upstarts. The earliest people, I think Professor Peterson talked about Chong Mong-ju yesterday, early merit subject of the Chosun dynasty. His family was not very illustrious. Chong Do-jun, who I will talk about later this afternoon, not very illustrious. They were people, bureaucrats coming from provincial areas. They are not part of the central government. They're waiting for the central government to retire, as it were, so that they can compete for the positions and so forth. So a lot of provincial wannabes came out, and they are the ones who became interested in this. Why? Because the people in the capital weren't interested in this new Neo-Confucianism. For them, things were fine, as long as they had their land and so forth. So there developed a kind of new elite out in the provinces who became very interested. They used their Neo-Confucianism and the study of Neo-Confucian texts primarily as a way of upsetting their superiors, i.e. the old guys in the capital of Kaesong. And they eventually did rise to power towards the end of the Goryeo period with the help of Mongols, and they reformed education in Korea to, in fact, create Neo-Confucian education. So a man by the name of Isek and his compatriot was Chong Mong-ju. Another figure in that area was Chong Do-jun. These were people from very poor backgrounds in the country who get in a position where they can reform education. So Chong Mong-ju, Chong Do-jun, and Isek are all appointed dean of the Confucian Academy. And what they do in that academy is to introduce the Neo-Confucian curriculum. All right? They become a closed society. So these new elite very quickly identify with each other. They're all taught by each other. I don't know if Professor Peterson told you about the struggles in the New Chosun period when the fifth son, the fourth son, the third son, the second son were all fighting each other to get succession to the throne. The one thing that they could not touch, though, was these Confucian elites, because these sons actually had been educated by them. So Isek was never touched. I mean, Chong Mong-ju was killed, but Isek was never touched. He had been the patriarch of the academy. So he might be exiled. He was actually exiled for 13 years before, and then died there, but they never could touch him. So this new elite, a provincial elite, comes to power and, in fact, promulgates New Confucianism. One aspect of the New Confucianism of this elite is that the people weren't terribly dedicated to the idea of public service. People like An Hyang and Kilje and others actually thought it was okay to be a Confucian scholar without serving in government. And they preferred to live in the country. They preferred to live in the provinces rather than go to the city and capital. And so there actually developed a group of Confucians who thought that Confucians are the moral treasure of the country. Don't employ them. Let them preserve the truth, but don't employ them. And again, a kind of eremiticism, a sense of hermit lifestyle. And many people, Chong Mong-ju later, and even Isek had the ideas later on in their life, that the best Confucian was the unemployed Confucian. That Confucians really are repositories for truth. They teach children, they hand on the truth, they preserve purity, they don't get involved in politics. Not all Confucians thought this, but some did. Then, of course, the new elite then, of course, seeks very quickly to displace the older elite, landowning elite that had been patronized by the Mongols, and eventually they become connected. All these people in the city of Kaesong become connected to a young man by the name of Yi Seung-gae. Yi Seung-gae was a warrior. He came from a military family located in northern Korea. He had been appointed to various provincial posts and so forth. He too, actually, Yi Seung-gae, did get lessons from Chung Mong-ju, Isek, and others about this. When he is called by the last Koryang Wang, the last king of the third last king of the Koryo period, and he is called and told by the king to go north to investigate what the Ming Dynasty Chinese are doing on the border and to dismantle any fortresses that they have. Cheong Do-jun, Isek, and Chung Mong-ju advised Yi Seung-gae not to do this. Their argument is that these are the legitimate power of China. The Mongols are still in China, but the Ming are taking over territory. So therefore, it would be wrong for a warrior of Korea or military of Korea to, in fact, insult the Chinese. So what do they tell him? Turn around, get rid of the king. And they actually instigate Yi Seung-gae's coup d'etat. They force him to, in fact, displace the king. They are the ones who also appoint his successors, two successors after him, and they maintain the Koryo kingship by the scholars themselves pick their own candidates to be king. But they're puppet kings, obviously. The scholars are already in power. By 1392, of course, Yi Seung-gae has enough support that, in fact, he can declare the end of the Koryo period and he establishes the new Chosun period. But Yi Seung-gae is, of course, beholden to his Neo-Confucian scholar friends. They are the rough and ready new elite. They get immediately immense amount of power. And Yi Seung-gae himself is a little bit taken back. He doesn't know how to run a government. So he turns the government over to Neo-Confucians. They run the government. From then on, they increase their power all the way down to the 18th century. Periodically, the Chosun kings will try to keep their bureaucrats in line, but they're not really successful. So by and large, Neo-Confucians rise to power very, very quickly. Okay, one of the first things that the Neo-Confucians in Korea do is they disestablish Buddhism. That is, these new rough and ready Neo-Confucian scholars don't like royal patronage of Buddhism. So series of proclamations are made. One young scholar at the Sungyunguan actually writes a letter to the king, and he makes this claim. Long ago, Confucius taught the correct way. He passed that way on to his disciple, Mencius. But after the death of Mencius, the way was lost. And for 1,000 years, Buddhists and Taoists confused the population. Until our own time, when Cheong Do-jung, another Confucian scholar, picked up the way and has revived it. So this is a student at the Sungyunguan writing to the king, telling him that the true inheritors of the Confucian way are not in China, they're in Korea. That the Tong Jodon becomes a merit subject, later becomes prime minister, and then actually is given charge of the government, that in fact he represents ultra-orthodoxy. Cheong Do-jun's appointees to the first court under King Taejo, the first king of the Chosun dynasty, are all his classmates. So they all get appointed. And in fact, within the space of 40 years, 4,000 Buddhist temples are changed over into Confucian academies. Literally, 400,000 landed slaves that are connected with Buddhist temples are turned over to the government, or those slaves are put into the military, or they're sent back into farming. Women in the new city of Seoul are, by law, no longer allowed to visit Buddhist monasteries, and Buddhist monks, by 1450, can't even come to cities unless they have a special passport. They have to have a token issued by the central government. So very quickly, this disestablishment of Buddhist thing. The argument that the Neo-Confucians in the early Chosun dynasty give for this persecution or disestablishment of Buddhism are the same arguments that were propounded in the Tang dynasty. That is that Buddhism and Taoism do not add to the welfare of society. Therefore, the king should withdraw his patronage. The government should stop paying for these two establishments, and the functions of those establishments should be taken over by Confucians. Okay, by 1450, there are only 200 temples left in the whole of the peninsula, and those are protected temples. They are under the direct control of the royal family. All other temples are either burned to the ground, they are converted into a Confucian school, or they're given away as manor houses for the new elite. So again, Buddhism very quickly almost disappears and so forth. Now, Buddhism continues to be of interest to the Chosun kings, but by and large, by the time we get to the middle period, even that begins to wane. Throughout the Chosun period, the Neo-Confucians of Korea also become very, very rigid in regard to what they mean by Neo-Confucianism. And they consider that the Jushi school, Jushi was a Song Dynasty philosopher, his interpretations are in fact the best. Now, that wasn't something they invented. Actually, the Mongols had said the same thing, that they liked Jushi because Jushi school, which had developed in Zhenan in China, was actually kind of upsetting to the establishment. And the Mongols didn't like the establishment, so they promoted Jushi Confucianism. Koreans adopted from the Mongols the idea that Jushi is the only orthodox teaching. And so they developed Jushi Neo-Confucianism. All school curriculums were changed so that everybody had to study. Before you study the classics, you study the commentaries written by Jushi. So by studying the commentaries by Jushi, then you read the classics. So you have an orthodox understanding of it. The civil service exam was also changed by 1500 so that, in fact, the only subjects you could be examined on, you could be examined on military and medical and other things, but if you were to take the civil service exams that lead to the degree of Chinsa, advanced scholar, you had to do it on Jushi. So all the exam questions were about Jushi's commentaries, and everything had to be orthodox. This eventually led to the development of an orthodoxy, and people did not rise and fall in the government unless they had thorough knowledge of the Jushi interpretation of Neo-Confucianism. Okay? Yi Sung-gae's supporters among this new elite become merit subjects, and their merit subjects, even though they may not hold office after 4 or 5 generations, nevertheless, they become very powerful clans. So that the Chung family, the various Yi families, and so forth, that are a part of the supporters of Yi Sung-gae, even today still are very important. They don't hold office, they're not in the government, and so on, but nevertheless, they are respected elite clans that go all the way back to the Chosun period. They also take over the National Academy. What develops between the 16th and the 19th century is that certain regions of scholars in certain regions of Korea begin to compete for control over education. And some, just stay away from the whole thing. Others try to get into the court and so forth. Eventually, again, conflict among different interpreters of the classics does appear. Phase 2 of the Confucianization of Koryo, of course, is that the Koreans give up the use of Mongol law and adopt the Ming Code. In 1368, the Ming Dynasty arose, successfully got rid of the Mongols. Koreans finally switched their allegiance from the Mongols to the Ming. Thereafter, Koreans had to keep convincing the Ming that they were loyal, but the first way to show that was they adopted the Ming Law Code. And the Ming Law Code is in existence. We can actually read it. And early Neo-Confucians took that Ming Code and adapted it to Korea. Basically, it's 90% of the early Chosun Code is exactly the same as the Ming Code. Again, as a way of showing that Korea was a loyal member, vassal to the Chinese state. Phase 3 sought to, in fact, limit the number of Koreans who could become monks by eliminating both monk exams as well as permission. By 1600, for example, a family had to apply to the local magistrate if they wanted their son to become a Buddhist monk. And it was up to the magistrate to allow or not allow them that to happen. After the 17th century, nobody became monks. There were very few monks and so forth. If anything, it's members of the royal family, distant members of the royal family, who become monks and continue the tradition. So Buddhists and Taoists are pretty much restricted. Many of the Buddhists take refuge in mountain areas where, of course, they lose all contact with their own traditions and become temple guardians. They just basically take care of the temple building, but they don't know anything about Buddhism, and they don't know anything about Taoism, and they really don't are not well. And the result, of course, is that Buddhism is pretty much defunct. Buddhist lands, again, and holdings, as well as metal, all precious metals that are held by Buddhists, now go into the central government. And the government redistributes lands to reward the new elite, takes lands away from the old elite, redistributes the thing, and then also redistributes that. The system of slavery, of course, which Buddhism used in order to build up its wealth, now is transferred to Confucians. So Confucians now are in charge of the slaves. And Confucians have the territory with landed slaves and tenant farmers and so on and so forth. So that continues. And then, I think we have more. Oh, okay. Then, of course, there develops, throughout the Chosun period, various lineages. And again, these are scholar lineages in which teachers of certain regions have a following, and they compete within the central government to become powerful and so forth. Within those lineages, there developed a lot of diversity about how to interpret Jushi. Some people, though it was not legal, did in fact critique Jushi, but would not publish their critique until after they were dead. So their descendants published it. There are quite a few Wangyang Ming scholars in Korea, but we don't see their records until much later. Okay, so Jushi Neo-Confucian orthodoxy is there. They also, and I will be talking about that this afternoon, they developed very sophisticated techniques about understanding the relationship between the principle of the universe, and emotion. So the so-called Igi debates between Itaege and others is a long, extended series of debates in which elements of Jushi Neo-Confucianism are sort of analyzed almost to death. That itself gets into issues. Community compacts are also important. Community compacts are literally provincial law contracts that scholars write up to govern a village. As early as the Sung Dynasty in China, Sung Dynasty scholars did create compacts. So a scholar in a small village would write up basically a basic law for the village. Everyone in the village would then come, sign onto that. They would also agree to save up money for the village itself. In Korea is the only place that I know where the compacts were really widespread. Korean Neo-Confucians, especially people living out in the rural areas, created community compacts, a lot of them. The Confucian scholar became technically the head of the village. And everyone agreed to teach children in such a way. They all agreed that if children need money to take the exams, that the community will finance this. Everyone agreed to pay as much money to the community compact so that they could keep a shrine there. When the offerings to Confucius and the sages were held, everyone would contribute. So basically, it's a basic law that governed villages, and Koreans actually did a lot of these. I think Il Gok wrote 17 different community compacts for various peoples in Gangwon-do and Gyeonggi-do, and those villages followed that basic law written for them by Confucian scholars all the way down to the 20th century. So, very thing. The other, again, downside of the new Confucian orthodoxy, obviously, we've heard a lot about this, was the Neo-Confucians in Chosun Dynasty restricted the movement of women. Unlike the Koryo period and early periods where women, were free to move around, in the Chosun Dynasty, they followed Jushi's kare, the home rituals, in which women became cloistered. So they had to stay in their houses until the sun set. After the sun set, then women could leave the house as long as they were covered and meet other women. So at nighttime, women were walking around the cities and the towns, but during the day they had to stay inside their houses and so forth. So there was clearly a androcentric form of society, not very good for women. Yeah.
Slaves were part of the indigenous population, or after the battle, or
Slaves? You could lose status in Chosun society if you didn't do what the king wanted, if you sided with the wrong enemy, if you didn't perform well in a battle and if you didn't pay your taxes. The king had the power to turn any village into a slave village. And once they are slaves, then the king had the power to assign slaves to different parcels of land. Now, when I'm talking about slaves, we're really talking about landed workers. You can't kill a slave with impunity. I mean, you could be punished. But it means that they are landed, they are tied to pieces of land, and as somebody changes office, they get control over the use of the land, and along with that go the land workers. So it's not like our North American notions of slavery that slaves are property.
But there were chattel slaves.
Yeah, they're landed, really landed.
Are you
farm.
talking about these are like government-owned slaves?
Yeah, they're all government-owned slaves, yeah. And when you get a new job, you are assigned a certain number of these along with the land. But the point is that you have to get these workers to produce that which will support your family. Because you're not given a salary, you're given land instead. So,
what part of the indigenous tribes
which indigenous?
I know like in Taiwan.
Koreans themselves are immigrants into the, excuse me, Koreans are immigrants from Central Asia. They landed in the peninsula probably around 1000 BC. So there are no original inhabitants. Unlike the Ainu in Japan, where the Ainu may in fact have been Siberian migrants into the northern islands, Korea's people are basically people who immigrated there anyway. There are some Chinese and Japanese bloodlines, but that's much later. So, yeah, no indigenous population. Is that correct? Am I right? Yeah. Okay. So again, one of the other sides, and again, on the right side is always the bad side. One of the issues that confronts Neo-Confucianism within Korea is, of course, the marriage of Neo-Confucian orthodoxy with elite landed interests. That is the development of clans and families who are all Neo-Confucian, but they're also hungry for power. And what happens is factionalism begins to characterize and bring Chosun dynasty government almost to a standstill, meaning those who are trained in the adherence and loyalty to a regional teacher carry that loyalty into the central government, try to promote other members of that lineage to the detriment of anybody who is holding office. And the switches between the Namin and the old party, the southern party, the short older party, the younger older party, there were all these lineages competing within the central government, each of which officially was dedicated to the common good, but of course also meant in order to achieve the common good, we had to get rid of that other lineage. And a whole series of literati purges, and a man by the name of Han Jong-man actually, he tells us this in his diary. He says that when my brother was appointed to the Ministry of Rights, I didn't agree with him. So I went around to the Minister of Personnel and the Censor General, spreading rumors to get my brother out of office. He responded, along with my father, to try to kill me. So here is an example, and we have this recorded in his biography, that he attempted to get rid of his brother out of government, but then his father and his brother actually tried to kill him. And he escaped and ran off to Jeju or wherever he went, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of factionalism that appears within Korean politics. But they are all Neo-Confucians. They all adhere to the same. What happens is they marry the interest of a landowning class with an ideology. So that the factionalism, which otherwise might be ideological or it might be regional, now in fact carries with it a kind of life and death intentionality. So we've got to get those Namin out of government, and that's our duty. And we'll use any means possible to get that faction out of government. All right? And they consider it their moral duty to promote the interests of their particular faction. Not a good thing. All right? And eventually that causes sort of the downfall of Neo-Confucianism. One of the other aspects of Neo-Confucianism in the Chosun, of course, is the spreading of Neo-Confucian values into other classes. Very important. By the 16th century, Neo-Confucians are not only themselves adhering to an orthodox interpretation of the classics, and they have control over all the organs of government, but now they, especially in their appointments at the local level, begin to enforce Confucian morality on the lower classes. So the artisan class, farmer class, warrior class, or military class, they must now conform to the directions of the local Confucian bureaucrat. All right? Now, this Confucian bureaucrat who's in a local village is also responsible for teaching. So local villages will set up schools to teach children how to read and write and so forth. And the local Confucian master basically makes sure that the morality of the village conforms to what he expects it to be. So the influence of Neo-Confucianism at almost all classes except the slave class pretty much permeates within 100 years after the founding of the dynasty. Different from Japan, certainly different from China. In China, Neo-Confucianism was just one of many different ideas, and the Chinese never became ultra-orthodox in regard to it. But in Korea, they did. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. It wasn't the study of classical literature, but it was the study of things like farming manuals and basic mathematics was taught, how to keep books. They also taught children how to memorize basic things like the 1,000-character classic, where these are little poems in which be good to mommy, be good to daddy, God will reward you, heaven will take care of you, that type of thing. These were the 1,000-character classics is a morality book that children learned and memorized by heart, even if they didn't understand how to write it, but they memorized it. So, yeah, some did. Yeah, some did. It's slow to begin with, but I think by the middle of the 19th century, well over 40% of the total population of Korea can read and write in some form. It doesn't, and not necessarily classical Chinese, but it might be Hangul and so forth. I think by the beginnings of the 20th century, it's closer to 60%. By the end of the Korean War, it's 80%, and now it's 100% literacy, and so forth. But again, the later period is Neo-Confucianism gets displaced, Western science comes in, modern education techniques come in, and so on and so forth.